Melanie. Do you think it is possible to reverse global climate change? Yeah, it's a very big question, right? I'm certainly optimistic. I think that we're in a position in today's world that we are having to make a lot of really big decisions. And those big decisions are something that has to happen right now. We're already seeing that. I think this past year has been a really good example of there have been some decisions such as pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement that seem like a really bad thing on paper. But at the end of the day, when that happened, there are big businesses, there are local governments, state governments that have stood up and have actually done more than they have in the past, because we are at a very interesting point in time where we have an opportunity to change the world. And all it takes is us holding up our end of the bargain. So it's not going to be an immediate process. We're not going to solve the problems and reverse it tomorrow, certainly. But we're making really good progress, and we're making it pretty quickly. So I am really hopeful. And one more question from Melanie. Where is the largest batch of coral bleaching that I have seen? There was a great deal of bleaching in 2016 and 2017. My personal experience was mostly on the Great Barrier Reef, and especially in that far northern section. We saw about 29% of the corals in the far north actually die during 2016. And then they got hit again in 2017, and we lost about the same percentage of coral. So that was a huge, huge percentage of an amazing ecosystem that we watched perish. That being said, there are still some really amazing places in Australia, and if we get to it in the slides, I'll actually show you why that conversation is so important and why it's maybe not what we all think. Another question from Brittany. In the film, we could see how the bleaching events took their toll on you. Could I describe the experience and how I look back on it now? From Joseph. Yeah, so one funny thing is I was never really supposed to be in the film. I was actually hired to put my camera systems in the water, and one thing led to another, and I really love coral. That's why I'm here having this talk with you guys. It's something that I'm really passionate about. I really, really enjoy coral reefs and have a really deep connection. And so when it has become my job to, kind of document their demise, it's hard. It's something that I deal with every day, and I think anyone that works in ecology or in environmental sciences deals with that kind of ecological stress that it puts on ourselves, because we're really, really happy and connected to the places we work on. And so I look back on it actually quite fondly. I wouldn't trade it for the world. Somebody recently said to me, perhaps following your passion is following your heartbreak. And I obviously really vibe with that idea, because I dealt with a lot of struggles emotionally making the film, because I was watching something that I really, really love, die before my eyes. And that's never easy. But I also wouldn't trade it for the world, because I know that what we did is something that is shareable to the average person. It's shareable with you guys. And that's extremely important for me. And I definitely take a little bit of pride in what we've done and how we've been able to communicate this problem back to the average person. Have certain types of corals gone extinct because of global climate change? From Riley. There's a handful of corals that were already really rare that have definitely been decimated. I hesitate to use the word extinct, but they're certainly on the verge. They're very close. There is one species off the top of my head that we consider extinct in nature in Hawaii, but we do have backups of that coral in the laboratory in some of our field experiments. But there's certainly going to be, we're going to see some extinctions of corals, for sure. That's just the reality of it, but more importantly, it's about focusing on what we know we can protect and how we move forward in a productive manner that way. It's a really good question. I appreciate that one, Riley. Thank you. So moving forward just a little bit, we just watched the video. So one of the biggest things in science that we don't necessarily talk about too often is, scientists are made out to be these really big thinkers, and There's all this complex nature to that type of work. But at the core of everything, there's an idea. No matter what you're doing, and everything starts with an idea. And ours was taking an ecosystem that looks like this. This is a really healthy, high coral coverage image from a coral reef that's obviously doing really well. What we wanted to do was visualize this beautiful ecosystem making its transition to look like this, where they've lost their color, just like we've just learned in our video. They no longer have their energy source, and they end up being really vivid. That ultimately, when they die, ends up looking like this. It starts to get covered in algae and can look really gross. So that was the idea. I want to visualize this process and then show it to people in a really tangible and digestible way, because that's what we need nowadays. So quickly, a couple more questions. We have, what is the best things we can do to help coral reefs? Yeah, super big question with a lot of different answers. But the biggest one is obviously making the changes in our own individual lives, and more importantly, in our communities. I also think that starts with a conversation. We put the cart before the horse a little bit with the climate conversation in this country. We started with doom and gloom doesn't really work for people, unfortunately. So what we have to do is start having conversations with those around us, whether it's at our school, in our community, or within our families. So it's those conversations that actually start us off, and we all have people around us that love us and care for us. So by expressing what we know is true and expressing what we care about and are passionate about, the people around us become passionate about it. They become supportive of what you care about. And it's that care and that willingness to change our lives for the betterment of the things around us that we love that really goes a long way. But there's also a long list of things that we can do that impact our surroundings, impact our own carbon footprints. Thinking about the way we eat types of red meat is extremely important. That's one of the best individual actions that we can take when it comes to reducing our own carbon footprints. And then there are other ones that we all know, walk a little bit more. Don't drive if you don't have to. Throw on, move towards electric, install solar, all of these big, big pictures. Don't use plastic water bottles. One of my personal favorites that we don't talk about is, I assume most people watching right now, if you were to go home and turn on your shower and turn it all the way to the hottest point, it would probably burn you. Well, why is your water heater that hot? Nobody needs the water to be boiling when you get in the shower. So by turning it down even 10 degrees to a point that it's not as scalding, that could A, save you a ton of money on your energy bill every month, and it also saves a great deal of carbon emissions. So there are these little tiny changes that actually go a really long way and make a huge difference. So I hope that answers the question, but it's not a simple answer. There's no silver bullet. Every single place in the world is going to have a different answer. Where I live in Boulder, Colorado, has a different answer than Sydney, Australia, or even Atlanta, Georgia. Wherever you are, your community has a different set of best practices to move forward than another one. Got one more question from Donna M right now. How many types of coral are there? So I work on hard corals, scleractinian corals, so to speak. You can actually see one in this image. It's obviously dying, but they have skeletons. And of those types of corals, there are about 650 to 700 species on the planet. The Great Barrier Reef, where I do most of my work, there's about 400 species on the Great Barrier Reef that you can find. So they're really quite diverse, and they're incredibly hard to identify as well, because they actually can take on different shapes and forms depending on their environmental factors, which is kind of interesting. Not a lot of other things do that. All right, one more question. How long did it take to film Chasing Coral? This film took about 3.5 years. So it started really at the end of 2013, beginning of 2014, and we cut the production and filming of Chasing Coral in June of 2016. And then from there, there's still another like 6 months worth of editing and all of the things that go on behind the scenes with the film. So it was a very long project. I spent 2.5 years of my life in the field working on it. One of the funny things about that is throughout those 2 or 3 years, we made a lot of mistakes. And this is one of my other takeaways from the project is failure is part of the process always. No matter what you do, failure is going to happen, and it's actually a good thing, especially in science. So something that's so funny is when we fail in science, there's actually a repercussion that actually leads to a better question most of the time. So we find a hypothesis, we take a stab at it, and it actually ends up allowing us to provide a better question after the fact, which is pretty cool. So we failed a lot in chasing coral, and I want to talk a little bit about how exactly we failed, and it's kind of a fun story, and it's ultimately what made chasing coral so interesting. So one more question real quick before we talk about that is, how often do you travel to coral reefs to ensure that bleaching is not getting out of hand? From Maddie. So bleaching is a complex issue, so I can't necessarily stop it, but my team is really the only team on the planet that's continually traveling at a global scale to document the bleaching process. So I actually get to do it pretty frequently. Right now, my life mostly working with students around the world. So I've taken a step back from my science for the most part, and now I work with youth to engage them and get them stoked about what it means to be a scientist and how to ultimately find your way and pathway into helping out our planet in that sense of the word. So I get out there pretty often. I got to keep my gills wet. And how big is our team? From Darius. So when it comes to the film, there were hundreds of people that worked on it. We had a global call, so we reached out to divers and scientists and photographers around the world, and we had great support from the scientific community. So there's probably 500 or more people that had some form of input on the film in some sort of capacity. But our team in our impact campaign right now, which is what I'm doing today, we've got about a team of 10 or so that work for exposure labs and continually kind of push the message and are doing our best to try and inspire the people around us. So I'm going to show you guys a couple graphs to give you an example of how failure is part of the process and how we have to cope with that. So these are two models that show the coral bleaching event that we saw in 1998 on Australia's Great Barrier Reef and again in 2002. You'll notice that the red, or the heavy bleaching areas, is very far to the south, or toward the bottom portion of the graphs. If I were to give you this graph, one would assume that if I want to capture bleaching, I should put it in the south, right? That makes a lot of sense. And that's exactly what I did. I put all of my cameras down in these southern regions where you see the dark red color. What actually happened in 2016 didn't exactly match what I thought was going to happen. This was the data I was provided, so I made a decision and I went to the south. This is what 2016 looked like. Everything went to the north, all of the bleaching. So I failed epically. I spent a lot of money and all of my cameras were put down on that reef. So a couple quick questions. If the coral reefs died, how would it affect us? Yeah, it's a really big question. Coral reefs are an essential part of the big global ecosystem, especially in our oceans. We consider coral reefs to be the nurseries of the sea, so to speak. 25% of all life in the ocean makes its home on a coral reef at some point during its life cycle. Yet coral reefs only cover a fraction of a percent of the actual surface area of our planet. So you're talking about a very small space where a great deal of diversity and great deal of life live. If we remove that, you're immediately having a really big impact on that 25% of marine life, and that obviously has a chain reaction of the ecosystem. So you could move into ecosystems like the kelp forests or the mangroves. they're going to see repercussions from coral reefs dying. The other big one that's more direct to us as humans is most people live in coastal regions on the planet. And for example, in Southeastern Asia, so throughout Indonesia and the Philippines and Vietnam and Thailand and all of these locations that have lovely coral reefs, the people that live there make a living off of that. That's their livelihoods. That's how they get by. That's how they put food on the table. And so if you remove that from them, there's really big, big consequences. Those people might not be able to live where they're living right now. And it could cause a great deal of basically climate refugees. If they're losing their resource that keeps them alive, they might have to leave. They might have to go somewhere else, find another opportunity. And that can be really problematic. Too much migration of people can cause a lot of problems for the global economy. It can really become a large issue. So it's something that we really have to think about. Another question: what were some of the difficult times you encountered in chasing coral, and how did you overcome them? What did you learn from them? Yeah, I had a lot of challenges. The biggest one is probably technology underwater is a very complex thing to work with. Saltwater is not very friendly to tech. Um, and when you're living on these very remote islands, if something goes wrong, there's not a Home Depot down the street that I can go to. You're working with what you have, and you're working in a very creative mind space, which is also really fun. So you're having to use limited resources and make the most out of what you have and solve problems on the fly, which I personally enjoy a lot. But it's also the biggest challenge, and it's something that I've learned a lot is you have to be open to thinking critically and thinking in a creative space when you're working in the field. Um, it's a big challenge, but it's something that I actually enjoy quite a lot. It's an awesome question. Thank you for that one, Arnold. Melanie says, what was the most difficult thing you encountered while filming Chasing Coral? There's a couple. The emotional tie is definitely a big one. It's really hard to watch something that you love die. So that's something that I had to cope with. But I also, like I said before, it's something that kind of made me want to continue going on. It's something that I felt really inspired by, and I knew that it was bigger than myself. That's probably the biggest one. I think the other most difficult thing was at the time thinking about how we were going to tell this story and tell people that it was bad, because some of the images, when corals are white or even when they get really pretty, sometimes they fluoresce. They can be like purple when they bleach, and they can be really aesthetically stunning. So it's hard to show something to somebody and it be beautiful and tell them that it's bad. That's a big challenge that we still have to work with a lot. And the last one that we have right now, or a couple. How can we kids help? Well, you guys are, the solution in my mind. You guys, we've thrown a big party for the past century, and we trashed the house, and you guys weren't invited. And now we're inviting you to come help clean it up. We can't frame it that way anymore. That's a very negative way of framing it. What I really want you guys to do instead is throw a better party. We need to change the way we think about these environmental issues, and you guys are going to be the generation that's going to be in power and have those decisions to be made. And so it's really about keeping you curious right now. Some of the things that you can do would be, looking into your own school, looking into your own community, getting more involved with the people in your neck of the woods that are doing really cool things, and bringing that to the peers around you, bringing it to your school. How can we be a better school? Can we recycle at a better rate? Can we compost? Can we set up water bottle refilling stations to limit the amount of plastic that we're using, which is also a huge issue in our ocean? There are lots of cool ideas that I think that you can do at a classroom level that would be really, really cool and would be extremely impactful for the coral reefs. It's what we do locally that ultimately has the biggest impact on coral reefs halfway around the world. And one more, this one's fun. What is the typical day in your life like from Shane? My life's super weird right now. I never expected to have the voice that I've been given. I'm actually giving this talk from a boardroom in Golden, Colorado, as I sit at the Colorado Environmental Film Festival. I'm giving another lecture after this in person. So it's a lot of talking to people. It's a lot of talking to kids. So every day is built up with video chats from people around the world and traveling a great deal to places to interact with people and do educational work and outreach work. So I'm always on the move. Things are going by really quickly right now for me, and I'm just trying to make the most out of what I've been given and trying to inspire you guys. That's what it's all about. That's my reward. I got really lucky. I've been really privileged to have this experience, and giving it back to the next generation is what it's all about for me. That's why I'm here. And I think that that's extremely important. Thank you for that question. I don't get asked that too frequently. Next one is, in the future, how do you plan to continue your pursuit of reviving corals? From me. All right, this is probably the coolest question that we're going to talk about. There's a lot of amazing, amazing things out in the world that scientists are doing to protect corals. One of them is actually looking at them and treating them as seed banks. So corals reproduce in a very unique way. They throw their gametes up into the water column and they float around. Those are baby corals, and they can go land in other places. So one of the things that we're doing to revive corals is looking at places that don't tend to bleach and then protecting them and looking at where they're positioned in the ocean, within the ocean currents. Can those places that we protect actually carry seeds or carry baby corals to other reefs around them that might not be that lucky? So I think that's really cool. It's something that we're really excited about. And the other one would be to cross-pollinate corals that have survived. So something that is actually further on in this PowerPoint, and if we don't get there, that's perfectly okay. I'd rather ask your question. But I'll tell you a little bit about the work that I did, and that was we tried to go to the reefs that are dead and look for survivors. So what I do is I find the winners, find the guys that made it through, and then I collect them. And they have a story to tell, right? How did you survive? Why did you survive? Quite frankly, sometimes they shouldn't be there. The reef is so degraded, and all of a sudden you've got this healthy coral. So what's your story? You must have something genetic, something physiological that's allowing you to do so well. So we take those corals, and then we can crossbreed corals that are those survivors in the hopes that their babies will be like their parents. Their parents were survivors. They were strong during these events. And so our hope is that those babies will have the same characteristics that let them fare well. I think that's a pretty cool way of going about it. And so those are just two of the many ways that you can go about reviving coral. I know you guys said that you had talked to David Vaughn as well. There's obviously amazing stuff going on that he's doing with the microfragmentation and all these novel things. I think that's really cool. All right, a couple more questions. How do you stay so humble after being in such a successful movie? Um, like I said before, I was never supposed to be in this film. The first time I knew that I was in the film was the first time I watched it. There's a funny story that I'll tell you. Jeff Orlowski, the director, texted me, and he said, "Hey, man, are you ready to watch the film?" And I wrote him back. I said, well, of course. I put 2 years of my life into this. I'm really excited, man, but I'm also really nervous. And he wrote me back something very simple. He said, "You should be." And that's because I wasn't supposed to be in the film, and now I'm such a large role in it that I've just kind of let it ride, and I hope that I'm humble. And for me, it's about the coral. We've had this opportunity. We put coral on a big stage, and that's just super cool to me. It's not about me. The film's not about me at the end of the day. It's about the coral. That's what the spotlight's on, and for me, it's just I hope that my passion and my vulnerability in the film can actually become a messenger for the people around me and inspire people to do more. And I think that's really incredible. Next question: do you consider yourself the Lorax of coral? I've heard the term Lorax, and I know it's a movie, but I actually don't know much about it. So maybe, I guess, I'm a voice for the coral, I like to think. Then have you ever been hurt doing your job? Not really. I guess I broke my toe on a boat recently, and I've also been stung by many jellyfish. And give me 1 second, I just have to stand up quickly and take care of something. All right, one more question. So we talked a little bit about have you been hurt doing your job? Yeah, I think the answer is yes. There's always the potential for jellyfish stings, things like that nature. Um, it happens, but it's all worth it at the end. I've never been seriously injured for sure. Um, but all right, I think that's the last question for now. So we've got like almost 20 minutes left. Let's continue going through some of these slides for sure. Um, so this is the system that I built. So previously we just talked about taking one more step back. I put my cameras here in the very far south in 2016, where obviously didn't work out. The heat wave went up into the northern region, and I made a big mistake. My permitting was in the south. It's something that was a huge challenge. We failed epically in Australia. But what we decided to do was we went from building this system that can take the pictures itself. It has no human side of it. It just sits and takes pictures. And they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. So we had to make a drastic decision. I bailed on these camera systems, and we had to move into something like this. I ended up having to do these time lapses by hand, manually, every single day. So diving twice a day for about 3 hours each time, spending 6 hours a day underwater, taking the same pictures over and over again for 2 months. And that ultimately told the story, which is part of why failure is so interesting. Without the failure of the cameras and without the failure of being in the wrong place, the story doesn't tell itself. We don't have the same emotional ties to it because now we have humans in the water who have to deal with what they're seeing, what they're documenting. And so that's a really interesting portion of the way the story went. Um, so now I want to talk just briefly to explain what we've seen over the past 3 years and how serious that actually is. So how extreme has this warming been? Here's a really cool concatenated graph that will actually explain a little bit as to how serious this temperature has been and as to how incredibly scary it can look. This is a graph of how we visualize where corals could be bleaching and how detrimental that heat can be to them. This is a concatenation or a collection of all the data layered on top of each other from June 2014 through May 2017. There's a bleaching event that lasted about 3 years. And really the only thing I want to point out to you here is that you'll see that blue references no stress. There is not a place on our planet over the past 3 years that does not fall into the category of a warning for bleaching. Every corner of our planet had seen a 2 degrees centigrade rise or anomaly in its temperature, then we could actually cope with. So not an individual place on the planet had no stress. We saw bleaching at a global scale, which is something that's pretty incredible and pretty scary. So we've got another question from Alexis. In the film, you used notebooks underwater. We are wondering how that worked exactly. Yeah, so there are actually special paper and special notebooks that scuba divers use. You use your normal pencil and a normal eraser, and the paper itself is just a little bit different. It doesn't fall apart. It's just almost kind of laminated in a sense, so it allows you to work. They're super easy to find. Your local dive store has a notebook that will work underwater, no question, and it's extremely useful. But good question. They're definitely something that if you're not a diver, it's like, how are they pulling that off? It's pretty crazy. Um, the next question is, how much citizen science is being used by coral scientists? Well, a great deal, actually. So as you can imagine, I always joke, we can't Jane Goodall the oceans. It's impossible to spend that amount of time. You're limited to about 2 hours every dive. That's all you get. And so when it comes to citizen science, anyone that has access to a coral reef, or anybody that's a diver or a snorkeler or has that ability to go and check those things out, sharing that information, sharing those observations with scientists through things like Reef Check. There are some great organizations out there that are trying to build those databases, build those backbones that we can use as scientists. And that information is invaluable to us. There's some really great programs. In fact, David Vaughn at Mote Marine Lab has some really cool citizen science programs where you can go out there and get certified with them and go help grow coral with them. So it's definitely a huge portion right now. In fact, I think we need more of it, and we need to be doing it more cohesively. So we're going to get into the last portion of what I have in the presentation. And this is something that I'm really passionate about and I think is extremely important to be talking about, especially with youth. And that is that science has a communication problem. Scientists are not good at talking to the average person. That's just how it is. They're very specialized. They think in a very particular way. And when it comes to bringing that back down to a digestible manner for the average person, they can struggle a lot. And that gets reflected in how things are portrayed both in the media and both in the way we think about science. So a really good example of this is we tend to box things into black and white. We like it to be one or the other. There's not a lot of gray area. And so a good example of that is in our media. We desire black and white. So here are two articles that have been published over the past 18 months, one of which titled Obituary, Great Barrier Reef, 25 million years ago to 2016. That's a huge over-exaggeration, right? It's telling people that the Great Barrier Reef is dead, which isn't totally true. And then you have the total polar opposite of this one that says Australia's Great Barrier Reef is not being killed off because of global warming. The people who know it best have confirmed. Also not true. But you've got the both polar extremes. People want that type of conversation. And it's really hard to explain that to people, that it falls in between. There's a gray area here. So before I go into the next slide, we've got two more questions, one from Brittany or from Min. What sacrifices have you had to make in order to study coral? Yeah, that's a big question. I'm obviously not making a ton of money here or getting rich and making the most out of anything. So I think the biggest sacrifice is just the acceptance that I'm doing what I love and that's what's important. And the payout isn't necessarily the biggest thing. I travel a lot. There are lots of sacrifices that I have to make every day, but at the end, I don't feel that I work a day in my life because I'm supporting what I really care about and I'm working on an issue that I find extremely important. And that's the most important thing. That's what keeps me going. From Melanie, what is the most common coral that you see? So it totally depends on where you are in the world. Different reefs have different commonalities, but the species of corals called Acropora are definitely that backbone. They're kind of like the weeds of the coral reef. They're very efficient at reproducing, and they're kind of the first ones that recolonize. So they're everywhere. You kind of think of them as staghorn corals would be the common name. Next one is, can we bring coral back to life when it dies? No, we can't, but what we can do is bring them back when they're bleached. When they're bleached, they're not dead. They look white, and there's been a connotation that that means mortality, and it doesn't. It actually just means that they're in this like kind of waiting phase, so to speak, for the temperatures to drop back down, and then they can actually rejuvenate themselves. But once they're dead, they're dead. One of the ironies of that is that the baby corals that we've been talking about actually prefer to land on dead corals, which is kind of cool. One more question. Did you ever want to do a different job? Yeah, absolutely. I think we all have different dreams as we go out. At one point in my life, I wanted to be a doctor, for sure. I thought that sounded really cool. But science as a whole was something that I really wanted to do. I studied botany in college, so I've always been really interested in plants as well. So there's always that potential in my life. But corals are definitely the one that I fell in love with and have pursued. So there's always I always joke around, don't tell the corals that I've been cheating on them with my plants. But yeah, there's obviously always cool opportunities that I'm interested in. So continuing on with this notion of things don't fall into black and white categories. Some of my recent work was up on the far north Great Barrier Reef. And the big picture sets expectations. So these are two models that show the scale of mortality that we saw in that far northern section between Papua New Guinea and Australia. Based on this, we would assume that on that far right image, that the inshore reefs that are in the red would have been really damaged, and that the orange on the outside of the reef isn't as damaged. So I'm going to show you some pictures as to why we think that and what the reality is of that. So again, to the inshore stuff, we expect to be dead, and the outer shore stuff, we expect to be pretty nice. So I'm going to show you some images from my recent trip. This is from the inshore. You can see very clearly that this image is about 100% coral mortality. There's nothing alive in this image, it's all dead. Is about 100% coral mortality. There's nothing alive in this image, it's all dead. That's what we expect, right? So it's going with our expectations. This is a picture from that same reef, but you'll notice there's a living coral there. There's that one survivor, that one little piece of this coral that actually lived. And that's really exciting. These are the corals that I'm looking for. These are the ones that hold the secrets for the future. And so it's not all black and white. It's not all dead. There are winners, and this is an example of that. This is another really important image. This is the most hopeful image I've ever taken. This image is probably about the size of your smartphone, and it has 5 different species of baby corals on an extremely degraded reef. So it means that the corals are reproducing. It means that they're coming back, and it means that they're actually already beginning to rejuvenate those places that have been dead. So this is an extremely hopeful image, and it shows that the Great Barrier Reef isn't dead or alive. It's dynamic. It's constantly changing right now. It's changing in a bad way, but there are reasons for hope, and this is the biggest reason for me. This is a picture of an entire reef in that inshore area. It shouldn't exist. This is a healthy, full coral coverage reef in a place that has just been decimated with heat. So why? This entire region or location where I took this picture is thriving. So it has some big questions. It has the ability to give us intel into how these places can survive into the future. And I think that's really cool. So it's just another example of how things aren't black and white. So before I go on to the outer reef, we have one question. Would you agree that you're a coral doctor, Kyle? I am not a doctor. I have a bachelor's in evolutionary biology and ecology. I do not have a PhD. So I probably wouldn't call myself a doctor just because of that. My term that I usually use for myself is coral nerd. That's the term that I tend to run with, and I like it quite a lot. So not a coral doctor, just a coral nerd. So we have 5 more minutes, so I'm going to cruise through some of these because I think we're on to something here, but continue pumping out the questions. That's what I'm here for, and that's I want to hear you guys' opinion. Here's a picture from the outer reef. This is one of the most diverse places I've ever dove, this picture in particular. This is what we hoped it would look like. It's still pretty healthy, and that's remarkable. We want to find out why it's still healthy and how we can promote that in places that might not have been so lucky. Here's another picture from the same ecosystem. Amazing coral coverage. There's still this out there. It's worth fighting for. This is what gives us so much hope. There are even big corals that have micro coral reefs growing on top of them. This is one of the most magnificent things I've ever seen. You have a miniature micro coral reef growing within its own coral reef. That's really cool, and that's why we're hopeful. These ecosystems are what gives us so much optimism moving forward. Is they're still out there. We have the opportunity to protect them. We just got to go do it. However, you still see things like this. This is on that outer reef where we expect to see healthy corals, and we're still seeing areas that could be bleaching, like this image. And we also see areas that are highly degraded. This is a picture that has, about 80% coral coverage on that outer reef. So again, it really is just about why it's not black and white. The inshore reef is mostly dead, absolutely. But there are still really cool places in the inshore reef. And the outer reef is mostly alive and thriving. But there are still places like this that aren't so lucky and have been really damaged recently. So we have to talk about the gray area. All of it's gray. And in that same sense, and this is the most important part of this talk in my mind, is science is made out to be black and white. we see pictures like this all the time. Scientists around a map talking, very serious faces, doesn't look like a whole lot of joy going on. We even see it underwater. Very serious note taking, even though you're on a beautiful coral reef, it looks very serious. It looks very sciencey, so to speak. Or even things like this. Again, very serious, getting our coral collections, putting them in there. These are the pictures that we talk about science with, and particularly to you guys. But what's really cool are the pictures that you don't see, because we love what we do. Scientists don't get to be human. They're meant to be objective, but when you spend some time out in the field, A, you get to go to really cool places, but most importantly, you get moments like this. That coral behind those two is about 800 years old. And we know that. That's incredibly exciting. And you can see the excitement in them. Arms wide open, super stoked. This is what science is all about. This is why you get into science and why we do the work that we do. We have a lot of fun. And you don't see the pictures like this. You know, throwing up a hang loose because you saw something really cool, even though your mindset is objective and you're doing science and you're collecting data. This is what it's all about. Or just tagging your first turtle and having a huge smile on your face, pure joy, pure excitement. And the smiles continue. These are the images of scientists that we don't talk about, that we don't share with the world, because it's a very serious world, right? It's all of these misconceptions about science. People are happy. We love what we do. That's why we're here. And every now and then you get an underwater high five that means more than most things in the world, and I think that's absolutely lovely. So at that, that's kind of how I finished it. Nothing is black and white. That's the biggest takeaway, whether it's the corals themselves or what it means to be a scientist. It all falls in a gray area. And at that, that's how I have the end of this. Thank you guys for spending so much time with me today. I hope that it was worth your time. I really appreciated your questions. And it looks like we have another 1 minute or so. So if you have any last minute questions, I'll hang around and then I'll let you guys go. But thank you guys again. I really appreciate it. And I hope that this was useful and that you learned something. Thank you guys. Appreciate all of the love. All right, we got a couple. Thank you for all of the kind words. We got one question here. How long does it take corals to regenerate? That's a pretty easy question, actually. So we talked about how effective they are at reproducing. You give corals 5 years, they're going to be there. You're going to have a functional ecosystem. It's much like a wildfire. After you burn the forest down, the weedy corals come back, the grasses come back, so to speak, and then they continue to produce, and you get bigger and better corals, and the diversity comes back. So I'd say 15 years is probably that sweet spot to have a really functional ecosystem come back. And then to have the diversity you're probably talking about at the scale of decades. But it's totally doable. They're really good at doing it. All right, well, I think we're out of time. I really enjoyed this. I hope that all is good, and I hope that you guys can reach out. If you want to email me, please feel free to. My email is zack@chasingcoral.com, and it's Z-A-C-K. That's the most important part. Otherwise, you won't get it to me. But anything that I can do to support you guys in your classrooms or simply just continuing a conversation, please reach out. Really enjoyed working with all of you this morning, and at that, I guess I will cut it off and end it. Thank you all again for the support and all the love, and have a lovely weekend.